Picture walking into a wealthy Roman home in Pompeii and seeing a bronze wind chime shaped like a winged phallus, with bells dangling cheerfully over the front door, not hidden away but proudly displayed as the family's first line of defense against evil spirits and jealous neighbors. So sit back, grab a cup of tea, and get ready to discover the surprising ubiquity of phallic symbols in ancient Rome, explore how winged phallus wine chimes hung over doorways to protect homes from the evil eye, understand why Romans believed these explicit charms warded off bad luck and envy, and learn what Roman superstition, apotropaic magic, and the cultural context that made dangling phallus decorations as common as welcome mats reveals about a civilization whose beliefs were radically different from our own. Modern visitors to Pompeii often experience culture shock when confronted with the sheer quantity of phallic imagery throughout the ancient city, not just in brothels or bathhouses, where we might expect sexual imagery, but everywhere, carved into street corners, painted on bakery walls, hanging from doorways, worn as jewellery by children. What seemed shocking or obscene to us was, to Romans, as ordinary and innocent as a horseshoe over a door or a four-leaf clover charm. These weren't expressions of sexuality, but tools of protection, weapons against the most feared supernatural threat in the Roman world, the evil eye. The Latin word for these protective phallus symbols was fascinum, a term that gives us the English word fascinate, to cast a spell, to bewitch, to control through gaze. This linguistic connection isn't coincidental. Romans believed that certain people possessed the ability to harm through envious or malicious gazing. A beautiful child might fall sick after a stranger admired them too intensely. A prosperous merchant might suffer sudden business reversals after neighbours commented on his success. A general might lose a crucial battle after enemies cursed his military prowess. The evil eye, called invidia in Latin, from which we get envy, was a constant invisible threat that required constant visible protection. The fascinum served as a visual shield against this threat. The logic to Roman thinking was elegant. The evil eye operated through attention. A malicious gaze focused on you could cause harm. But if something even more attention-grabbing appeared in the gazer's path, the harmful attention would be deflected. What could be more attention-grabbing, more impossible to ignore than an enormous phallus? The shock value wasn't a bug, but a feature. The more outrageous the protective symbol, the more effectively it diverted dangerous attention away from the person or property it protected. This apotropaic principle, using shocking or repulsive images to ward off evil, appears in many cultures, but Romans took it to remarkable extremes. The fascinum wasn't merely a symbol of male fertility or divine power, though it carried those meanings too. It was primarily a weapon of spiritual self-defense, deployed against unseen enemies who struck through envy and malice. Understanding this function helps make sense of why phallus symbols appeared in contexts that seem bizarre to modern observers. Let's examine the various forms fascinum took in Roman life. The most common were personal amulets, small charms worn on cords around the neck or wrist. These ranged from simple terracotta penises affordable to anyone, to elaborate bronze pieces with wings, legs, or multiple phalluses for enhanced protection. Children especially wore these amulets, usually incorporated into the bulla, a protective locket that Roman boys wore until they came of age. The bulla itself often bore fascinum imagery, and additional phallic charms might hang from it. Parents believed this protected their children from the evil eye, to which youth and innocence were considered especially vulnerable. The tintinnabula, bronze wind chimes featuring winged phalluses with bells, represent perhaps the most spectacular form of fascinum. These hung from doorways, eaves, and garden pergolas throughout the Roman world. When wind moved them, the bells rang, announcing the charm's active protection. Some tintinnabula were simple, a single winged phallus with a few bells. Others were elaborate compositions featuring multiple phalluses, animals, human figures, and cascading bells, creating complex harmonies. The wealthiest Romans commissioned custom pieces from master bronzesmiths, turning protective magic into art. The winged phallus deserves special attention. Wings suggested divine power, speed and the ability to strike from any direction, perfect attributes for a protective symbol. Some scholars argue the wing specifically connected the charm to Mercury, messenger god and patron of merchants and travellers. Others see connections to various fertility deities. The wings might also simply emphasize the fascinum's active nature. It wasn't a passive symbol, but an aggressive defender, ready to fly at threats. Shop signs and commercial establishments featured fascinum prominently. Bakeries, taverns, fulleries, and countless other businesses displayed phallic symbols to protect their enterprises from competitors' envy and customers' ill will. Some signs showed realistic phalluses, others cartoonish or stylized versions. The symbols served dual purposes, protecting the business and advertising to customers that the proprietor took proper precautions. A shop without fascinum protection might be seen as negligent, risking not just supernatural harm but customers' doubts about the owner's competence. Phallic imagery appeared in the streets themselves. Pompeii's streets feature numerous carved phalluses in paving stones, pointing directions, though exactly what they indicated remains debated. Some clearly mark paths to brothels, serving as ancient advertising. Others might have indicated lucky or unlucky streets, safe routes, or simply served as general protective markers for the neighbourhood. The casual ubiquity of these carvings shows how thoroughly normalized phallic symbols were in Roman public spaces. Domestic spaces incorporated fascinum in various ways. Mosaics in entryways might feature elaborate phallic imagery, sometimes combined with eyes to stare back at the evil eye, or text warning against envy. Frescoes in domestic gardens often showed Priapus, the god of fertility and protection, brandishing his enormous phallus at potential intruders. These weren't hidden in private rooms, but displayed where visitors would immediately see them, the Roman equivalent of a beware of dog sign, but the dog was a supernatural guardian whose weapon was an exaggerated phallus. The god Priapus deserves extended discussion. Originally a minor fertility deity from Phrygia, Priapus became enormously popular in Roman culture. He was typically depicted as comically disproportionate, with a permanently erect phallus larger than himself. Gardens commonly featured Priapus statues or paintings, protecting crops from theft and blight. But his role extended beyond literal gardens to metaphorical ones. Any endeavour that needed protection from envy might invoke Priapus. He was simultaneously absurd and powerful, obscene and sacred, a combination that characterized much of Roman religious thought. Military standards, the banners and symbols carried by Roman legions, sometimes incorporated fascinum. This wasn't about sexual prowess, but about divine protection for soldiers facing death. The Roman military was deeply superstitious, seeking any supernatural advantage. A legion marching with fascinum symbols announced that they carried divine protection, psychological warfare against enemies who might share belief in the evil eye's power. Archaeological evidence from military camps shows that soldiers kept personal fascinum amulets, just like civilians. The materials and craftsmanship of fascinum objects reveal Roman social hierarchies. Wealthy Romans owned bronze or even silver fascinum pieces, sometimes gilded or decorated with precious stones. The metalwork could be exquisite, showing master craftsmen's skills. Middle-class Romans had simpler bronze amulets, perhaps cast from moulds rather than individually made. The poor made do with terracotta, cheap but still effective. Roman belief held that the symbol's power came from its form, not its material. Even slaves might wear crude fascinum amulets, though whether by choice or master's command varied. Children's fascinum amulets were particularly elaborate, reflecting parental anxiety. The Romans believed children, being innocent and beautiful, attracted the evil eye more than adults. A successful, healthy child made neighbours envious. Their praise, even if seemingly genuine, might carry hidden malice. New parents would immediately outfit infants with multiple protections, with fascinum as the most powerful. Some child amulets combined multiple symbolic elements: phallus, protective deities, warding gestures, creating layered defense against supernatural threats. The evil eye belief that made fascinum necessary requires deeper examination. Romans didn't view envy as merely an emotion, but as an active force capable of causing tangible harm. When someone envied your success, Their gaze could literally sicken you, damage your property, or bring bad luck. This wasn't metaphor, but literal cause and effect in Roman worldview. The Greek word baskanos, one who envies, and the Latin fascinum both carried connotations of binding, restraining, harmful magic directed through vision. The mechanics of evil eye harm, as Romans understood them, involved the gaze as a vector for malicious intention. Eyes, being windows of the soul, could project internal states outward. An envious person couldn't help but direct harmful emanations through their gaze. Vulnerable targets, the young, the beautiful, the successful, needed protection because their very virtues attracted dangerous attention. This created a paradox. Success required displaying it to maintain social position, but display attracted envy that could destroy that success. Fascinum resolved this paradox by allowing display while providing protection. The cross-cultural nature of evil eye beliefs provides context. Throughout the Mediterranean and Near East, similar beliefs and protective practices existed. Greek cultures had comparable apotropaic symbols. Jewish traditions included protective amulets and rituals against the evil eye. Egyptian magic incorporated protective symbols. Islamic cultures would later develop elaborate evil eye protections. Roman fascinum wasn't unique, but an especially explicit version of widespread protective practices. The phallus as protective symbol appears less commonly elsewhere, but the underlying fear of envious gazes was universal. Archaeological evidence for fascinum comes overwhelmingly from Pompeii and Herculaneum, cities frozen by Vesuvius's eruption in 79 CE. The volcanic preservation captured a moment in time, showing how thoroughly fascinum permeated Roman life museums' house. Thousands of fascinum objects recovered from these cities. Personal amulets found on bodies, tintinnabula still hanging from doorways, shop signs intact, domestic decorations in place. This abundance suggests that what we see in Pompeii reflected common practice throughout the Roman world, not local peculiarity. The context where archaeologists find fascinum reveal its omnipresence, in shops and workshops protecting business, in homes from the poorest to the wealthiest, guarding families in military camps, shielding soldiers, at crossroads and boundaries, marking transitions, in tombs, perhaps protecting the dead or warning grave robbers. The consistency across different contexts suggests universal belief in fascinum's protective power, transcending specific situations. If there was a threat, there was a fascinum to counter it. Museum collections of fascinum present interesting interpretive challenges. How do modern curators display explicitly sexual imagery in family-friendly museums? How do they explain that Romans didn't view these symbols as obscene? Some museums segregate fascinum in separate galleries with warnings. Others integrate them into normal displays with extensive explanation. A few simply omit them from exhibition, perpetuating Victorian-era censorship. The best interpretations emphasize cultural context, helping modern viewers understand ancient meanings without imposing contemporary moral judgments. Victorian-era archaeologists who first excavated Pompeii faced profound discomfort with fascinum discoveries. Raised in sexually repressive cultures that conflated nudity with immorality, they struggled to process a civilization where phallus symbols hung over respectable doorways. Many items were quietly removed from public excavations, stored in secret cabinets, accessible only to scholarly males. Published excavation reports sometimes omitted fascinum findings entirely, or described them in Latin to avoid corrupting English reading audiences. This censorship distorted understanding of Roman culture for generations. The scholarly rehabilitation of fascinum studies began in the mid-20th century as changing sexual mores allowed more honest academic discussion. Researchers recognized that interpreting Roman phallus symbols through Victorian prudery was methodologically bankrupt. They began examining fascinum in cultural context, comparing it to other protective symbols, and taking Roman explanations of its purpose seriously. Modern scholarship treats fascinum as a legitimate subject for religious, anthropological, and social historical analysis. Modern tourist reactions to Pompeii's fascinum reveal continuing cultural tensions. Some visitors are shocked, others amused. Some try to understand the cultural difference. Tour guides face the delicate task of explaining these symbols to diverse audiences with varying comfort levels. The challenge illustrates broader difficulties in public history. How do we present past cultures whose values differed radically from our own? Fascinum forces confrontation with the reality that Romans weren't just ancient versions of us, but people with genuinely different worldviews. The religious dimensions of fascinum extended beyond simple superstition. The phallus connected to numerous deities, each adding layers of meaning. Priapus, as mentioned, served as primary patron. But Mercury, Bacchus, and even Mars had phallic associations. Temple decorations sometimes featured explicit imagery that would scandalize modern religious spaces. Festival practices included phallic processions, ritual exposure, and ceremonial displays that celebrated fertility and divine power. These weren't secret rites, but public celebrations, demonstrating how thoroughly Roman religion integrated what we separate into sacred and profane. Prayers and incantations accompanied fascinum use in some contexts. While many Romans simply wore or displayed their charms passively, others spoke invocations when putting on amulets or hanging tintinnabula. These prayers might address specific deities, invoke general protective powers, or directly command the evil eye to turn away. The combination of visual symbol and spoken word created multi-layered protection, engaging multiple senses and channels of supernatural defense. The social class differences in fascinum use tell us about Roman stratification and shared beliefs. That both emperors and slaves used fascinum protection shows how thoroughly this belief permeated society. Wealthy Romans didn't consider themselves above such superstitions. Indeed, their greater success and visibility might make them more vulnerable to envious gazes. The difference lay in materials and elaboration, not in belief itself. A bronze tintinnabulum marked wealth. A terracotta amulet served the same protective function for those who could afford no better. Gender dynamics around fascinum were complex. While the phallus was masculine symbol, both men and women used fascinum protection. Women wore fascinum amulets and displayed them in their homes. Some scholars argue that women, being socially subordinate, might have felt especially vulnerable to envious attacks and thus needed extra protection. Others note that women's beauty made them targets of both admiring and malicious gazes. The fascinum protected against both, serving as supernatural barrier against unwanted attention of any kind. The role of fascinum in Roman childhood deserves special emphasis. Nearly every Roman child wore some form of phallic amulet. Infants received them days after birth. The bulla, that locket marking freeborn status, often incorporated fascinum imagery. Children's graves contained these amulets, suggesting they were buried with their owners, or that families placed new charms to protect the child's spirit. This universal childhood protection indicates how seriously Romans took evil eye threats and how completely fascinum was integrated into life cycle practices. The commercial aspects of fascinum reveal a significant economy. Craftsmen specialized in creating protective amulets. Bronze workers maintained workshops, producing tintinnabula in various designs and price points. Terracotta factories mass-produced cheap fascinum for popular markets. Some artisans achieved fame for particularly powerful or beautiful pieces. The trade in protective charms supported families and contributed to urban economies. Protecting against evil was a business, one that never lacked customers in a society permeated by fear of envious gazes. The relationship between fascinum and Roman concepts of masculinity adds another layer. The phallus symbolized not just male anatomy, but virtues, that complex bundle of qualities including courage, strength, and social power. Display of phallic imagery wasn't seen as crude, but as assertion of masculine potency in both literal and metaphorical senses. For Roman men, wearing or displaying fascinum proclaimed their virility while protecting it from envious detraction. The symbol simultaneously announced and defended masculine power. Yet this masculine symbolism didn't make fascinum exclusively male. Roman women displayed phallic symbols without apparent concern. This tells us that Romans distinguished between the phallus as anatomical reality and as symbolic power. Women could invoke phallic protection without contradiction because they understood it as divine force, not personal claim to maleness. This symbolic flexibility challenges modern assumptions about gender and religious symbolism. The archaeological record continues revealing new fascinum finds, each adding details to our understanding. A recent excavation in London uncovered a wooden phallus from Roman Britain. Rare due to Wood's poor preservation analysis showed elaborate carving despite the humble material, suggesting even perishable fascinum received careful craftsmanship. Elsewhere, excavators found gold fascinum amulets in elite burials, leather examples preserved in exceptional conditions, and even stone phalluses marking property boundaries. Each discovery reinforces how completely this protective symbol permeated Roman life. The question of whether Romans actually believed fascinum worked deserves consideration. Did educated Romans take evil eye belief seriously? The evidence suggests that skepticism and belief coexisted, as in most religious systems. Cicero, a sophisticated orator and philosopher, mentions fascinum in his writings, without explicit skepticism. Pliny the Elder, despite his generally rationalist approach, includes fascinum among legitimate protective measures. Even Romans who doubted magic's literal reality often used it just in case. Better to have protection and not need it than need it and not have it. The changing interpretations of fascinum over Rome's history reveal evolving attitudes. Republican-era sources treat it matter-of-factly. Imperial-era writers show some emerging self-consciousness, occasionally joking about superstitious fears while still describing fascinum use by the late Empire. Christian writers condemned fascinum along with all pagan practices. But the archaeological record suggests fascinum remained popular among common people even after Christianity's official triumph, persisting as folk practice long after its religious context was condemned. Christian opposition to fascinum was intense and explicit. Church fathers saw phallic symbolism as devil worship and sexual licentiousness. They couldn't or wouldn't recognize fascinum's protective function, interpreting all such imagery as obscenity. As Christianity spread, fascinum disappeared from public spaces but likely persisted in private. The survival of evil eye beliefs in Mediterranean Christian communities suggests that protective practices adapted to new religious contexts, though the explicit phallic symbols were suppressed. Modern survivals of evil eye protection throughout the Mediterranean provide interesting continuities. The Turkish Nazar, blue eye amulet, the Italian corno, horn gesture, the Greek mati, eye beads, all protect against the same envious gazes that worried Romans. While the explicit phallic imagery is gone, replaced by less sexually charged symbols, the underlying belief system survived Christianity's triumph. This suggests that fascinum's form was culturally specific, but its function addressed universal human concerns about envy and social vulnerability. Cross-cultural comparisons illuminate both Roman distinctiveness and human universals. Many cultures fear envious gazes and develop protective measures. What's distinctive about Rome is the choice of phallus as primary protective symbol and the complete openness of its display. Other cultures might use eyes, hands, geometric patterns, or divine figures. Romans used penises everywhere, proudly. This choice reveals something about Roman culture: its comfort with human body, its pragmatic approach to supernatural protection, its willingness to use shock value for beneficial purposes. The festival context of fascinum adds another dimension. Certain Roman festivals, particularly those honouring Bacchus and fertility deities, featured elaborate phallic displays, giant phallus effigies paraded through streets. Phallic hymns were sung, and ritualized obscenity was not just permitted, but required. These festivals allowed communal renewal, social bonding, and religious devotion through what would be considered public indecency in most modern contexts. The festival phalluses weren't fascinum in the narrow sense, but drew on similar symbolic reservoirs. The relationship between fascinum and Roman garden culture deserves mention. Romans were passionate gardeners, and gardens needed protection from theft, blight, and supernatural threats. Priapus statues stood guard, their prominent phalluses warning thieves while protecting plants from mystical harm. Some Priapus monuments included inscribed warnings threatening thieves with penetration, shocking to modern ears but apparently considered appropriately protective to Romans. The garden priapus combined fertility promotion with theft deterrence, magical protection with legal warning. Military uses of fascinum extended beyond personal amulets. Some defensive fortifications incorporated phallic carvings. Archaeological evidence from Hadrian's Wall and other Roman military sites shows phalluses carved into walls and gates. These served similar functions as civilian fascinum, protecting military installations from enemy curses and supernatural attack. Romans fighting physical enemies also worried about invisible spiritual warfare, deploying all available defences. The economics of fascinum production supported specialised craft industries. Bronze-working guilds included fascinum specialists. Pottery workshops devoted production lines to terracotta amulets. Even stone carvers included fascinum among their standard offerings. The demand for protective symbols created economic opportunities that persisted throughout Roman history. Archaeological evidence from workshop sites shows standardized production techniques suggesting high-volume manufacture for popular markets. The legal status of fascinum was unambiguous. It was completely legal and socially acceptable. No Roman law restricted fascinum display or possession. Court records contain no prosecutions for phallic imagery. This legal tolerance contrasted sharply with later European and American obscenity laws. What Romans found legally and socially acceptable, later Western cultures criminalized. This reversal illustrates how profoundly moral and legal standards can shift across cultures and centuries. The pedagogical aspects of fascinum transmission interest social historians. Children grew up surrounded by phallic symbols, worn them constantly, and absorbed their meaning through cultural immersion. Parents explained fascinum's protective function naturally, without embarrassment or special warnings. This early enculturation made fascinum use automatic and unconscious. Romans didn't think about their amulets any more than we think about pocket talismans or lucky charms. The cultural transmission of protective practices happened through everyday life, rather than formal instruction. The artistic sophistication of some fascinum pieces reminds us these weren't crude scrawls, but serious artistic productions. Master craftsmen applied genuine skill to creating beautiful, effective, protective symbols. Some tintinnabula show technical virtuosity in casting, balance, and acoustic design. They were genuine artworks whose function happened to be magical protection. This combination of artistic excellence and supernatural purpose characterizes Roman culture, which saw no contradiction between aesthetic beauty and magical utility. The geographic distribution of fascinum finds tells us about Roman cultural reach. Fascinum appears throughout the empire, Britain to Egypt, Spain to Syria. This wide distribution could suggest central Roman culture imposing practices on conquered peoples, or alternatively, that evil eye beliefs were sufficiently universal that fascinum resonated across cultures. Likely both factors operated. Romans spread their protective practices, and locals adopted them because they addressed existing fears. The preservation bias in archaeological record must be acknowledged. We find bronze and terracotta fascinum because these materials survive burial wood. Leather, cloth, and painted examples largely disappeared, probably vastly outnumbering what survives. This means the fascinum we see in museums represent a fraction of ancient reality. Every Roman might have owned multiple fascinum in various forms, with survival rates heavily skewing toward expensive, durable items. The metaphorical extensions of fascinum language reveal its cultural pervasiveness. Fascination originally meant being bewitched by evil eye. To fascinate someone was to harm them through envious gazing. Over time, the word acquired positive meanings, being captivated, entranced, charmed. This semantic shift perhaps reflects Christianity's suppression of the original meaning, while the word's emotional resonance survived. We still use fascinate without remembering its origins in Roman fear of malicious gazes. Modern commercial exploitation of Roman fascinum walks a fine line between education and titillation. Pompeii gift shops sell fascinum replicas, sometimes marketed as authentic historical items, sometimes as naughty souvenirs. Tourist guidebooks treat fascinum with varying degrees of seriousness. Some explain the cultural context. Others present it as ancient pornography. This commercialization risks obscuring genuine historical understanding beneath superficial shock value. The The pedagogical challenges teachers face when explaining fascinum to students illustrate ongoing cultural discomfort. How do you explain to teenagers why ancient Romans hung phallus wind chimes over doors without the explanation becoming either embarrassed or smirking? The best approaches emphasize cultural difference, functional purpose, and religious context. But the teacher explaining fascinum treads carefully, aware that giggles and discomfort might prevent actual learning. This educational challenge shows how profoundly our own cultural assumptions shape historical understanding. Academic studies of fascinum employ various theoretical frameworks. Anthropologists compare it to protective practices worldwide. Religious studies scholars examine its theological implications. Social historians analyze what it reveals about Roman anxieties and social structure. Gender studies researchers investigate its implications for understanding Roman masculinity and sexuality. Each disciplinary approach adds perspectives, though risk of modern frameworks distorting ancient realities remains constant. The modern revival of interest in fascinum, part of broader interest in ancient magic and religion, sometimes appropriates without understanding. New Age shops sell Roman protective amulets divorced from their original context. Modern pagans attempting Roman religious reconstruction debate proper fascinum use. These contemporary engagements, while showing continued fascination with Roman culture, often import modern assumptions about magic, sexuality, and protection that would puzzle ancient Romans. The lesson of fascinum ultimately concerns radical cultural difference. Romans weren't us in togas, but people with fundamentally different assumptions about how the world worked. They saw envious gazes as tangible threats and phalluses as effective shields. Their solution to supernatural problems involved public display of explicit symbols that we consider private or obscene. Neither romanticizing their beliefs nor dismissing them as primitive serves historical understanding. Taking them seriously as rational responses to perceived threats within their worldview helps us understand both Romans and ourselves. As we conclude this exploration of dangling phallus charms in ancient Rome, consider what fascinum reveals about human universals and cultural specifics: the fear of envy, the need for protection, the desire for supernatural help, these cross-cultures and centuries. But the specific solution, prominent phallic symbols as protective magic, was distinctly Roman. This combination of universal concern and particular response characterizes all culture. We share Romans' anxieties, but would never share their solutions. Understanding this gap helps us appreciate both what connects us across time and what separates us. The tintinnabula no longer ring over Roman doorways. The amulets no longer protect Roman children. The street carvings no longer ward off evil gazes. But fascinum's legacy persists in language, in museum collections, in ongoing scholarly debates, and in the reactions of modern viewers confronting ancient practices. These dangling phallus charms tell us that Romans lived in a world animated by supernatural forces requiring constant vigilance and creative protection. Their world may be lost, but the evidence of their beliefs, cast in bronze, carved in stone, fired in clay, endures, reminding us that people have always feared their neighbour's envy and have always sought, in whatever forms their culture provided, protection against malice hidden behind seemingly innocent gazes. The next time you encounter a four-leaf clover, knock on wood or throw salt over your shoulder, common Western protective gestures, remember that Romans did the same thing, they just used phalluses. Different symbol, same human need for control over uncontrollable forces, for protection against invisible threats, for comfort in an uncertain world. Fascinum wasn't obscenity but prayer, wasn't sexuality but defense, wasn't primitive superstition but sophisticated theology. Understanding this transforms our view of Romans and challenges us to examine our own protective practices with fresh eyes. We haven't outgrown the need for lucky charms. We've just changed their shape, forgetting that symbols are arbitrary but the human needs they address remain eternal.